Hey guys, it's Mrs. Wilbrin, and there's our screen. Okay, so this is your podcast for chapter 19. This is going to focus on sections 5 through 8. We're going to continue to talk about the differences between the North and South. Last week, we really focused on the difference in the geography between the North and South and the economy. And this week, we're going to explore some new areas. So, our guiding question stays the same. How was life in the North different from life in the South? And Mrs. Klein is going to be joining us for the second half of this podcast. Here we go. First, we have our vocabulary. Now, as you can see, the two bottom words, pull factor and push factor, I highlighted because those are the vocab words that you're going to be hearing in this podcast. Okay, a pull factor is an influence that draws someone to a new location, where a push factor is an influence that drives someone away from a location. All right, here we go. So we're going to start with internal improvements. And we're going to start with talking about the North. Okay, so transportation in the North. Factory owners needed fast, inexpensive ways to deliver their goods to distant customers. And South Carolina Congressman John C. Calhoun had a solution. He said, "Let us bind the Republic together." With a perfect system of roads and canals, Calhoun called such projects internal improvements. Okay. In 1806, Congress funded the construction of a national road across the Appalachian Mountains. The purpose of this highway was to connect the new western states with the east. Now remember, at this time, your western states, guys, are just these states in the Great Lakes area. Okay, these are our western states at this time. Okay. With even better roads, river travel was typically still faster and easier than travel by land. However, moving upstream against a river's current was hard work. So, inventors in both the United States and Europe experimented with boats powered by steam engines to solve this problem. In 1807, Robert Fulton, who you're looking at right here in this picture, showed that steamboats were practical by racing the steamboat Clermont upstream on New York's Hudson River. Fulton said, "I overtook many boats and parted with them as, as if they had been at anchor." Okay, so he's really stating this steam engine is moving me really fast. Okay, he's going upstream and he is passing many boats as if they were stopped at anchor. Okay. Of course, rivers weren't always located where people needed them. In 1817, the state of New York hired engineers and workers to build a 363-mile canal from the Hudson River to Lake Erie. The Erie Canal provided the first all-water link between farms on the Central Plains and East Coast cities. It was so successful that other states built canals as well. Okay, so this is super important, and you guys can see my little cursor right here. So all these farms that you have in this area by the Great Lakes, now we have a way to quickly get all of the goods that they're growing. We can put them on this Erie Canal and get them to the Hudson River. Okay, they come down the river to the Atlantic Ocean, and we can ship them not only to the East Coast, but you could even ship them to European markets. Okay, so the Erie Canal was huge. Okay, and it was really famous for providing this first water link between farms on the Central Plains or that Great Lakes area and East Coast cities. All right, we also have traveling by rail. So let's talk about railroads. The future of transportation, however, lay not on water, but on rails. Perhaps inspired by the success of steamboats, inventors developed steam powered locomotives. These trains traveled faster than steamboats and could go everywhere tracks could be laid, even across mountains. Okay, so that's all about the North, what we just talked about. So now I want to talk to you guys about transportation in the South and what that looked like. So here we go. Most of the rail lines in the United States were in the North. In the South, people and goods continued to move on rivers, where the slow current and broad channels of southern rivers made water travel easy and relatively cheap. Cotton was the most important southern product shipped by water. The cotton boom made New Orleans, the port at the mouth of the Mississippi, one of the South's few big cities. Once the cotton reached the sea, it was loaded onto sailing ships headed for ports in England or the North. Because river travel was the South's main form of transportation, most southern towns and cities sprang up along waterways with little need for roads or canals to connect these settlements, right? Because they're popping up next to rivers. So they're using those rivers instead of roads or canals to transport their goods. Okay. Southerners opposed bills in Congress that would use federal funds for internal improvement. Such projects, they believed, would benefit the North far more than the South. Okay. Some railroads were built in the South, including lines that helped Southern farmers ship their products to the North. Still, in 1860, the South had just 10,000 miles of rail, compared with over 20,000 miles of rail in the North. So, not quite fair there. Now, with this, guys, we're going to transfer it over to Mrs. Klein. And
thanks, Mrs. Wilburn. Hey, gang, it's Mrs. Klein. I'm here with the second part of your podcast. That's going to be, again, reiterating to you how life was different in the North and South at this particular time. And I'm going to focus specifically on society in both the South and the North. All right, you guys, here we go. For the most part, the South was not greatly affected by the Jacksonian spirit of equality and opportunity or the reform movements of the mid-1800s. Many Southerners in 1860 still measured wealth in terms of land and slaves. The result was a rigid social structure with a few rich plantation owners at the top, white farmers and workers in the middle, and African Americans, mostly enslaved, at the bottom. Slavery deeply affected the lives of all Southerners. So it didn't matter if you were somebody who owned slaves or not, slavery still had an impact. For example, even religion, you guys, was affected. Southern church leaders defended the practice of slavery, taking a position that divided them from any churches in the North whose leaders taught that slavery was unchristian. Now, I'm going to talk specifically about white Southerners here. A small group of wealthy plantation owners dominated the economy and politics of the South. While children of wealthy families often went to colleges and universities, others received little education. The majority of white families worked their own fields and made most of what they needed themselves. So they lived on like the small farms like this here, not this great big plantation that's here on the left. Now, since public schools were few and often inferior to those in the North, many white children were illiterate. They just simply didn't go to school. If you didn't have the money like the plantation owners had to send your kids to school, and you were a poor farmer working on your own, you didn't have the wherewithal to be able to send your kids to school. So many people in the South, in fact, most white Southerners were illiterate and didn't know how to read or write. Now let's shift to African Americans in the South. A small minority of the African Americans in the South were actually free blacks. Free blacks were often forced to wear special badges, pay extra taxes, and live separately from whites. The great majority of African Americans in the South, however, were slaves, and most were field hands who labored from dawn until past dusk. Now, society in the North. As in the South, most people in the North were neither wealthy nor powerful. By 1860, about 7 in 10 Northerners still lived on farms, but more and more Northerners were moving to towns and cities. Now, nearly all of the 50 largest urban areas were in the Northeast, and between 1840 and 1860, the populations of New York, Philadelphia, and Boston nearly tripled. As the Northern industry continued to grow, the roles of the women and men who were a part of these Northeast populations changed. Middle-class women focused on caring for the home and family, while the men went out to work and they actually came home with wages. Now, new or old, northern cities often lacked sewers and paved streets and had dirty and crowded neighborhoods where diseases spread rapidly. So cities, while they provided a good place to be able to come to get a job, sometimes the conditions in which people lived were really not that great. Now let's talk about African Americans in the North. After the American Revolution, all of the northern states had taken steps to end slavery. Although blacks in the North were free, they were not treated as equals to whites. In most states, in fact, they could not vote, hold office, serve on juries, or attend white churches and schools. So they basically lived in a completely segregated system, a segregated society. All right, now I want to turn my attention to immigrants who began to arrive into those northern cities. Now, between 1820 and 1860, 4 million immigrants, most of them from Ireland and Germany, swelled the North's growing population. Immigrants came to the United States for a variety of reasons, which can be categorized as either push factors or pull factors. And Mrs. Wilburn let you know, she mentioned that earlier at the beginning part of the podcast. So, push factors, you guys, are things that happen that force a person to move or emigrate. I like to think of this emigration with an E like they're exiting. So, it's some kind of a factor that's pushing them to exit their country and search for a new place to be able to go and live, like a famine, for example, or maybe warfare, or they're being persecuted. Pull factors, on the other hand, are factors that encourage a person to come into a new place. I like to think of this immigration with an I. When you're coming into a place, there's a reason that's pulling you. In this case, there were lots of job opportunities for immigrants to come into those northern cities and work in the factories. There was cheap land in the Midwest that brought a lot of people, that encouraged a lot of people to be able to, it was a pull factor that brought people here into the United States. So the hope of finding a job was really like the thing that pulled most immigrants into the cities in the American Northeast. Some Americans, you guys, resented the newcomers, especially the Irish. Irish immigrants faced hostility because many were Roman Catholic, unlike the rest of the United States, which was primarily at this point in time Protestant. German immigrants who came about the same time did not experience the same hostility that Irish immigrants endured, since most German immigrants were Protestant and middle class. And most of the Irish who came were incredibly poor. And then they had that different kind of foreign religion, since most of the people here in the United States were Protestant. All right, we're going to do a little bit of a review here, you guys. So in this podcast, you heard Mrs. Wilburn talk to you about transportation, where she told you that steamboats and railroads improved transportation for Northerners, making it easier for them to travel and to ship the goods that they were producing over long distances. In the South, however, people continued to travel by river, and rail lines were fewer than they were in the North. Now, in society, in the South, the wealthy few enjoyed great influence and power. However, even the poorest whites ranked above African Americans, whether they were free or slave. The North, too, had its wealthy class, but farmers and laborers alike typically believed that they could create comfortable lives for their families through hard work. All right, you guys, we're going to end this podcast right now. Peace out.